Hey guys, John Wesley here. Welcome to the program. It is December the 2nd, 2017. We are in the third week of this podcast series. Tonight is actually going to be a little bit different. I have a guest on with me tonight who is actually not a guest. This person is going to be joining me from here on out on the Saturday episode. Remember, we do an episode on Wednesday and at the end of the week on Saturday. But Jake the Slane is a guy that I have gotten to know over the last several months. I think he's going to bring something to the table. He's a very intelligent guy, very sharp on the outdoors and prepping and guns and stuff like that. And so I'm very excited about it. Jake, if you want to introduce yourself, man, tell us a little bit about you. Tell our viewers.
Hey, thanks, John. I do a whole lot of prepping and guns and political stuff. So this is going to be a very easy seat to fill. I think it'll be something really interesting and enjoyable.
Yeah, absolutely. I told someone yesterday that anyone who can articulate a point or that is good at having conversations and talking about the issues, it's really a good time to get into doing something like this, either to start a podcast or writing or whatever. I mean, every day that I wake up, it's like a new bombshell every day. If you pay attention to the corporate media, there's always something going on. So I think alternative media, independent media is very crucial to our cause, because the corporate media is ignoring, everything that we are about. They're twisting it. They're putting out their own narratives, and it's just, I tell people all the time, if you can do it and you want to sacrifice the time to do it, it's a really good time to get into the podcasting. So the one issue, I think the biggest, is the Kate Steinle murder situation, or whatever you want to call it. The guy was acquitted yesterday. I think probably a lot of people feel let down. I mean, obviously her family, you have an illegal alien who was deported 5 times, I believe, and was back in the country in a sanctuary city where they do not notify ICE or any federal agency, and this guy murdered her in cold blood on Pier 14. But, I think this goes into what we're talking about with illegal immigration and even immigration. Looking at the 1924 Philip Reed Act and the 40-year ban. What do you think about it, Jake? I mean, do you think it's proving our point?
Into immigration now. I mean, it's pretty crazy that someone who's a 7-time felon and has been deported 5 times just so happens to find a gun underneath a park bench and accidentally shooting a white female in the back, he allegedly doesn't even know how to operate a firearm, but somehow the gun goes off and he gets so excited and overwhelmed by it going off, not even realizing that he shot somebody, that he kicks it off into the water and then runs away. So he flees the scene. Yeah. So it's an unbelievable story when you take into account that he got off totally scot-free. Mm-hmm. Now, the bonus to this, as I understand it, is that the Trump DOJ has now issued an arrest warrant for him, but it's on something that happened back in like 2015. So it's not really, it's not something current that you can get excited about. But if nothing else, hopefully he'll be deported for the last time.
Yeah, do you think that warrant is for his deportation? I think someone said yesterday of recharging him, but that would be double jeopardy. I think it's probably for deportation, don't you?
Well, it's allegedly for him skipping out on a, what do you call it, where he was under like house arrest or something, and he skipped out of the country or skipped out of the state or whatever.
I got you. Yeah, they'll probably make his life a living hell. Because Trump talked about Kate Steinle throughout the campaign. But I think go ahead.
Is it Steinle or is it Steinle? I've heard it pronounced a couple different ways.
I've heard Steinle and Steinle as well, and I was
Go with
wondering.
Steinle, that's fine.
Yeah, I've heard Steinle and Steinle, but looking at her name now on my phone, it looks like it's Steinle, but I heard Rush Limbaugh say Steinle.
Which, I mean, that would make sense because there's no like EY, right? It's just LE.
Right. Yeah, but nonetheless, I think it's a tragic situation, and you have, her parents obviously were counting on our judicial system, and I think this just proves the point that there are, activist judges out there who are, they are judging these cases and letting people off the hook in a act of activism. I mean, you look at this guy, and I got his name here. It's Jose Ines Garcia Zarate, I believe is how you pronounce it. And like you said, 7-time felon. And the way you just described how it happened, he found this gun. I mean, the guy should be on death row right now, to be honest with you. He should have never been in the country, but with circumstances, he should have been convicted. And I think I honestly believe this has a lot to do with, the sanctuary cities and this judge. There was, I was on Twitter yesterday looking at some of the insane tweets that come out from the radical left. Have you ever heard of the Congo dandies? Have you ever heard of this term?
I have not heard of this term.
So Vice News ran a special 2 years ago on this group of African men. And they call themselves the Dandies of the Congo. And it's a very, kind of high-end men's club in Africa. These guys live in several different countries. I think Sudan is the most prominent country. But they live in like these mud huts with dirt floors and dirt roads. It's just massive poverty, third world living conditions. But the dandies wear these exotic suits. The snapshot for the documentary is like a photograph of this village, this third world village. You could see the fog floating in the air and like the big giant mosquitoes flying all around. And there's this like 6'5" African walking down the middle of the road with like a sunburst orange Versace suit on with gator skin shoes. And it's the craziest thing I've ever seen. But the reason I bring this up is because someone yesterday was making a point they were talking about race in comparison to IQ. And they were saying that even with these African situation being in a third world country and living in, harsh living conditions, that egalitarianism is real because these guys wear Versace suits and they work. One guy said he worked for 2 years to buy one gator skin Versace shoe, and then in the next year he bought the second shoe. But I actually watched the documentary a couple years ago. I know what they're talking about. But that was the example that these fools were using to say that everyone across the globe is the same, and it's crazy, man. It's flat out crazy. If you ever get a chance, it's very interesting to watch them running across a pasture with giraffes and zebras, and they're like in these Versace and what's the other brand? I don't know, some high-end suits.
Right. Yeah, I mean that's pretty extravagant. I mean, especially since you would think that the first thing on their mind would be for electricity, maybe a little bit of a foundation for a home, something to increase their living state.
Yeah.
But instead they find something to wrap around themselves. I mean, that's that's pretty crazy. That's some high time preference.
Yeah. I remember watching it. I don't think I watched the entire 2.5 hour documentary, but I remember one of the guys, like girlfriends or wives or something, was saying that, they would go days without eating because he was spending money on these suits. And it was like they were building these, you know how you can go to like a Lowe's or Home Depot and buy the, what are they called? They're like the big tall stand up cabinets, but you open the door, or wardrobe.
I like a wardrobe
Yeah,
area.
yeah.
Okay.
He was building a wardrobe for his Versace suits, and and trying to level it on this mud floor, where probably feces and everything else was sitting. But anyway, I don't know why I got it. Oh, I know it's
Well, I
because.
mean
Go ahead.
that's kind of interesting because if you think about it, they're literally thinking that rich people wear these suits, and so if they wear these suits, then they themselves become rich men.
Yeah. Well,
You know, if you
it's a sign of wealth to them.
yeah, I guess like on some level this is like an idea of will to power, but uh it's like maybe if it wasn't for the fact that they were utilizing their money in a poor manner.
Yeah.
Well, still, anyways, but yeah, getting back to this Kate Steinle thing, or yeah, is ultimately what it gets down to is she was literally sacrificed on this altar of like political correctness, um, that that has been pitched to us, since I was a little kid,
Mm-hmm.
and it's finally kind of coming to a head. It's like the black teens up north that had tortured that retarded kid, and they were charged with hate crimes, but then those were dropped,
Yeah.
and then that was up north, totally different state.
Mm-hmm.
I know everybody knows that San Fran is kind of a it's kind of a shit lib town, but
Yeah.
or commie town, whatever. But we kind of expect that. But on the East Coast, you wouldn't really think that happened. But ultimately, it's this idea that these laws, are as far as hate crimes go, they're only for white people,
Yeah.
and when someone of color does it, it's like, which there in of itself, the term a person of color. I mean, white people have color,
Right.
but it's this idea that it's enriching, it's ethnically exhilarating, but it's this idea that as far as with Steinle, these people, I'm not sure what the makeup of the jury was, but those people who let this guy go,
Mm-hmm.
literally just wrote him a check, or wrote anybody a check. It's open season.
Yeah.
It's open season on white people, and I'm sure she was a shit lib, the Steinle lady,
Yeah.
but she ultimately took one for the team.
Yeah. It's funny you brought that up. I'll tell you something personal, or not personal for me, but something that has happened in the area that I live, and I'm gonna be careful from details. That way, I won't dox myself. But a few years ago, I'm in a rural area, and there is a town of like, I don't know, probably 2,000 people. It's a teeny, teeny, tiny town. Uh, you know, 20, 30 miles from where I live. But anyway, there was this old country store. And it was operated by the same family for just decades and decades. And it was known to be kind of a good old boy store, and it was kind of a bar and a convenience store. And a lot of the family and family friends would, hang out on the weekends, and they would fry fish and stuff like, good Southern traditions. And one Friday night, a black guy, actually two black guys, were traveling through this area, which is out in the middle of nowhere. They were from out of town, and they were drinking and probably partaking in narcotics. And they stopped at the store, and one of the guys walked into the store and wanted to buy beer. So the store owner, which I know personally, asked for this guy's ID. Now, this wasn't a place that a lot of black people hung out at, but there is actually a factory right down the road, and I've been in there when I was a child and would see some of the older black guys get off of work, come through this store, get, fish plates or whatever. And so it was kind of if they knew you, it really didn't matter who you were, what color or something like that. But anyway, the guy did not have his ID. And so at this particular time, SLED had been traveling around the state busting stores for selling to underage people. So the store owner refused. And this guy began to run his mouth, and a fight broke out. And after the whole thing was over with, the store owner and his son and his son's friend are in federal prison right now, pulling 13 years for a hate crime. Mm. Yeah. And essentially, the guy was roughed up because he did walk into a place where, you didn't go in there. Even someone like me, I would have never walked in there and kind of popped off at the mouth. But still, they asked him to leave. He didn't have his ID. He started, being, typical. And so anyway, I think the system is set up against us. That's my opinion. The system is set up against us, just like the situation you're referring to. I believe it was in Ohio, or either Detroit. Anyway, where they I
think it was Detroit. Yeah, sounds about right.
They kidnapped the retarded guy, and it didn't stick. But if that would have been, if the races would have been reversed, you and I both know what would have happened.
Yeah, man. It's just, it is ultimately just this turning of things. I mean, a really good example I heard was in the U.S., blacks make up about 13% of the population. Mm-hmm. And so they're a minority, an overwhelming minority. And that's why we have these different laws allowing them to get ahead, right? Mm-hmm. So that people can't, can't treat them poorly or whatever. And so then, we move over to South Africa, where whites are a vast minority. I mean, even more so than, what the blacks in America. I mean, I think it's like something like under 10%.
Yeah.
And the crazy bit is, you would think that in a black majority country, that these different laws for that blacks have in the U.S. would be extended towards the whites.
Yeah.
But it's actually the exact opposite. Blacks still get that in South Africa, and whites don't. And so you have people who are very smart and well educated, and they're living in freaking trailers or like 10 houses or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, I had a guy, or actually a female, that tweeted out to me today. I'm trying to see. We'd said something. There was a post about multiculturalism and diversity, and this black young black girl tweeted out to me, and she's actually from South Africa, and she was saying how she brought it up. She said that whites, I'm trying to find it, but she said whites are still allowed to maintain their culture and identity in South Africa as long as they don't hurt anyone. And I tweeted her back. I was like, "You've got to be kidding me!" It's like the farmers are being slaughtered over there. It's like a genocide. But anyway, I said this earlier a few days ago to someone, and they told me they hadn't never heard it, and so I want to make sure I'm correct on this, but I want to say Pat Buchanan's Death of the West shows where whites only make up 12% of the global population.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, it's something like um, I think it's somewhere between 10 and 12. I think you're correct. Yeah, I'm not gonna
And
split
and
hairs,
I
but
think the numbers that he or as far as the demographic change in the U.S., like 2050, we will be under 50%, and then globally, we will be under 10. I think is what the trajectories are showing. So it's, if they say, well, because blacks are a minority in the United States, we have to have all of these civil rights organizations. We have to have the Black Congressional Caucus. We have to have the Negro College Fund and all of these different things. Then whites are a global minority. So why is it that we are not allowed to have that? I think that's the golden question. It's like sometimes it gets to a point where I don't even want to talk about it with people because it's so obvious. It's like, whites are the only ones who cannot defend themselves without being accused of being, Hitler's Third Reich or something.
right. Yeah. I mean, it's almost like well, okay. So this is another thing that would be kind of pertinent at this point. But I mean, the idea that liberals and whoever you want to call running things, that they look at it as a dog bites man.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that essentially they look at it as that, well, this is what you expect, and so that if you don't expect this and you get bit and then you hit the dog or kick the dog or whatever, or retaliate, then you're automatically the bad guy. So it's this idea that if it's man bites dog, it's really bad.
Right.
But dog bites man is to be expected. So that's why you see stuff going on in these places like Chicago and Detroit and whatnot. And, people just don't do anything about it because, this is what you expect from blacks, right? Because this is what they do in Africa.
Yeah.
But it's this idea that you can't just have that kind of an expectation for people when it's your country. It's you have your own laws, you have your own traditions.
Mm-hmm.
This is, there's certain ways people are supposed to carry themselves because they're in someone else's culture.
Right.
And this is why you had back in the 50s, you look at the pictures, black men carried themselves with dignity. They had very good fine clothes and stuff that they were wearing that just made them look just higher end than nowadays, where your black youth will wear their pants around their knees or whatever. And I work with a lady who she's black, and she and I talk about this on a regular basis, and she's just distraught. It's just it really tears her up that the youth nowadays just they kill each other for no reason. They kill fights for no reason. They're always like robbing or whatever. And she said that that's not a wrong way to look at it because that's exactly what's happening. And she said that she herself, she's not a conservative,
mm-hmm.
But she does like what Trump's doing. She thinks that Mexicans should be sent back to Mexico because she says that America is not for Mexicans. And I just found that very funny. And she refers to people who are on the dole from the government. She refers to that money that she's getting, the tax money, as the white man's dollar. And I just found that very, very interesting. But so it's the older generation. You always have like dissenters, but there's people that you meet that are just more level-headed. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if that's, you always hear that kind of thing comes with age.
Yeah.
So that could be definitely part of it, but it's this idea that I don't know if that anything changed, but it's this idea that before they were held to a standard, and now there is no standard, and so the bull is running awry in the china shop,
right?
And nobody's willing to stop it because that'd be racist.
Yeah, and I tend to use personal experiences or things that I've witnessed in my lifetime. But just to make a point and build off of what you're saying with the older generation, My great grandfather was a mill worker, and he moved to my hometown in 1955 with his wife, my great grandmother, and their 3 sons. And this is this is where my life or my lineage begins, in this hometown. But anyway, they were not, they weren't financially, wealthy, but they were wealthy in, American values and morals, and loved American identity, and at the time was white identity. But they bought a small 4-bedroom mill village house. In these rural areas, you'd have a factory, and then there would be these mill villages surrounding the factory. And, they were typically kind of lower class working people, but the houses and the yards were clean, and, people took pride in them. And it was just a really good environment, really simple people, but those people tend to be some of the, the lovingest people you would ever meet. But anyway, my great-grandfather died in 2001. By this time, the mill was shut down. He retired from it. And every time a family member in these different houses would die and the homes would become vacant, you had white flight, because you had one particular home that had been sold to or rented out to Section 8, and it just began. It was like a snowball effect. So what took place? White flight. All the white people moved, the remaining died off, and eventually by 2012, my great-grandmother at 82 years old was surrounded, and this neighborhood that I used to play out in the streets when I was a kid, this neighborhood was now a slummy, drug-infested ghetto. And my great-grandmother was hardcore, like from the old school, and she refused to move. And she actually shot at some thieves that were trying to steal meat out of her deep freezer. And they basically tormented her because she was the last white person on the street, and we tried to beg her to leave. But anyway, eventually at 84 years old, she had to sell her home because she couldn't take it no more, and move in with her, with my uncle, her son, for the last year of her life. And I remember her just bawling, the day I helped her move out, because that was her home. And I think that was the final red pill for me on race. I'll be honest with you, I've never really forgot it. And I think a lot of older black people would have been flat out ashamed of that situation. So anyway, yeah. I'll tell you what, I know we were talking about Flynn earlier. We can move on into Trump, because I know you've probably got some things to say about it. Flynn yesterday pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI, same charge that George Papadopoulos was indicted with. Now, Paul Manafort and Rick Gates were the first to the fall. They have connections with the Podesta brothers, and I really think at this point all Trump supporters are getting a little eerie, getting a little nervous about it. And I think we're all hoping that maybe it's still tied to the Clintons in some way, or even going into the Podesta group. But what do you think? How do you think this looks for Trump?
Well, I mean, I know the media is trying to pitch it like it's a bad thing. Trump saying that ultimately what came out of the investigation was that they literally couldn't find no collusion. Mm-hmm. And he tweeted out, I think it was today. No, it wasn't today. It was a couple of days ago. But anyways, he tweeted out that he just didn't understand why Flynn had lied to him. Right. Because he said, it's not illegal what he did. Yeah. So he's just like, it just didn't make any sense that he had lied to the FBI and the vice president. And that's ultimately why he got boot or whatever.
Unless it was something to do with some business dealings with Flynn's son, or his personal, you know what I mean? So he interviewed with Mike Pence and essentially told Mike Pence he had no connections. And it's the same thing with Rick Gates and Manafort, where they were dealing with the Podesta group, with Ukraine, and this lobbying gig. But I wonder if General Flynn and his son has some sort of dealings with Russia that has nothing to do with the Trump administration or campaign. I think we'll see, in the days coming. But I'll tell you this: I think Trump, and you can, give me your opinion on this. Obviously the alt-right, and really any non-mainstream Republican jumped on the Trump train. I was a little skeptical about Trump at the beginning, but when he started talking about immigration, that's when I began to listen. But Trump's an egotistical person, and I don't mean that as a major insult. I think all alpha males deal with this problem, but I have always been skeptical of Trump to the point where I know Trump wants approval. Trump wants people to like him. He wants to, he wants pats on the back, so to speak. And so my skepticism has been, is he going to backtrack to gain approval from whoever? And I think we've, witnessed this since he took office with, him backtracking on DACA. I think we've seen this from, the campaign. We were going to deport 11 million illegal aliens to now it's only the deportation of violent crime offenders. And I understand it's a hard animal to deal with when you're in Washington. And, Steve Bannon, which was the voice for the wall, Steve Bannon was the voice for the Muslim ban. He is gone now. But what do you think? I mean, do you think Trump will pull through this and get these things done?
Ultimately, you got to look at it from he's been in for a year now, and he's ultimately, it's kind of like this is a pretty big animal. So as far as illegal immigration goes, I mean, it's estimated at least 11 million.
Yeah.
But it's probably more like 30. Yeah. And so the thing is, because this is such a big animal, you got to start somewhere, and ultimately these people are all, criminals. So all he has to do is go in and say, if you were not born here, and you're a criminal, you're gone, and use ICE, because once you get rid of those people, you're already going to get people self-deporting.
Yeah, and
then once the criminals are gone, the people who already self-deport are gone. That's going to be a pretty decent chunk. And then all you have to do is move, do what the liberals and the Democrats do, move that field goal and say, okay, well, now we're going after people who weren't born here, and that includes their kids, because at that point I would try and secure something from the judiciary stating that it doesn't matter if you were born here. If your parents aren't legal, then you're not legal. Right. And then at that point, you pull that pin out. Once you pull that one linchpin out, the parents. Yeah. And it gets rid of that whole family tree. So, ultimately, he says, he doesn't want to deport kids, right? Yeah. But you don't. I wouldn't pitch it like that. You're not deporting kids, okay? You're sending away criminals, and you don't want to leave. You don't want their kids to be stranded here. You want the families to be together. And so, how I would pitch it is deportation with family unity.
Yeah. That's actually. It's really, if we're going to deport a mother and father, or in a lot of situations, there really isn't a mother and a father. It's probably a mother to be more likely, or most likely. But they shouldn't leave their kids here. It's just like DACA, 800,000, and the media spins it as children, but you and I know these are adults. The majority of them are adults, and it's like, when did it get to a point? When did we get to a place in history where we're responsible for the world? And it's going back to the 24 Philip Reed Act, where there was like this big spirit of revival of nationalism, and we were a little paranoid after World War I. and we essentially banned immigration for 40 years. I think it was like maybe 1,200 visas were issued after the 24 ban, or like 1,200 people were let in or something like that. And then that went all the way up to 1964, which is when the Hart-Celler Act was passed, as you know, and that, in my opinion, was the downfall of it all. And people say, well, it was only 170,000 green cards. That's 170,000 non-Americans, you know. And the immigration that we saw before 24 was, European, white Europeans. And so it's, I start rambling a little bit when I get on this subject because there's so much involved with it. But it's like, why don't we have the right to determine our future for our kids, for us? You know, you and I are younger guys. It's like, I'm not racist. I just don't want to see my country turn into a third world country, or even more realistically, just a non-white country. You know what I mean?
Right. Well, I mean, ultimately, what's happened now? I saw a video, and it was a guy being interviewed, and he actually made a very good comment. It was very enlightening. Essentially, he made the comment that in the past, a nation had a people who had a nationality, and the root word of nation or nationality, because it's the same root word, is essentially, the translation means it's a people who have a common history, language, and ancestry. So that would mean that they're all ethnically similar. So ultimately, what you have is America's no longer a nation. And so what happened is, essentially, with the what do you call it, the classical liberalism, that out of classical liberalism came the idea of the separation of church and state. And multiculturalism is just another step down that, using that same logic. And so what you have with multiculturalism is that it's not just the separation of church and state, but multiculturalism is the separation of nation and people.
Right.
And so what it does is essentially, it's allegedly attempting to head off any kind of conflict, because with a nation, a people owns that area, right? That region belongs to this people or ethnic group or whatever.
Yeah.
And when you have a multicultural society, what you end up having is nobody owns this place. Everybody can live here. You just have to get along. And what ends up happening is the exact opposite. You actually run into more conflict. I mean, just since the 1950s, the amount of crime in the U.S. has just skyrocketed. Now, granted, it's kind of leveled off now, but it's still like really high from where it was.
Right.
But still, it's this idea that, we as people, we as a generation, we were never asked. We were never. They never sought our vote on this topic, asking if we, the people who own this space, were accepting of a multicultural society. We were literally robbed.
Right.
And us as a generation, I mean, we're what, 2 generations after the point with which that bill was signed in the 60s.
Yeah.
I mean, literally, we were robbed of our birthright. This is something that our ancestors, I mean, I don't know about you, but I've got family that fought at Valley Forge, or at Valley Forge. Their names on the roster. So it's this idea that, I mean, just over 200 years, we've been fighting to retain the space as a nation state for us.
Yeah.
And within just a few decades, it's been given away.
Well, I think
right.
Well, if you look at, I was watching, or I think my wife was watching a Faith Goldie video the other day or something like that. I think it was Faith Goldie, but she was talking about Justin Trudeau in Canada, and his quote, and I have it pulled up right here. I just pulled it up because I thought about it. But he told the New York Times that Canada is becoming a new kind of country, not defined by our history or European national origins, but by a pan-cultural heritage. There is no core identity, no mainstream in Canada, concluding that he sees Canada as the first post-national state. And if you look at that compared to Barack Obama's, we're not a country of Christians, but a country of Muslims and atheists and Buddhists and all this. And, I'm okay with different religions. I know, your background in religion's different from traditional Protestantism, but the fact is that we are having our national identity stripped from us. Not only what I would consider traditional Americanism, but also European identity. And it's like, I have family. I think the first of my family, they landed here in 1605. I had a grandfather and an uncle who grandfather fought in the Battle of Cold Harbor for the Confederacy, and then my uncle, seventh generation uncle, died on the second accident of the CL or CH Hunley, the submarine in the Charleston Harbor. And I have family that trace back to, revolutionary times. But it's like, if you look at Africa, if you look at Japan, if you look at Saudi Arabia, all of these other non-white countries, they maintain not only a homogenous society, but they maintain their culture and their identity. They're not removing monuments. They're not removing, memorials and changing names of streets and buildings. I was telling you the other week about Clemson and the Tillman Hall, the oldest building on Clemson University's campus. And the family that's descendants of Pitchfork Bill Tillman live in the town that I live in now. And they're wanting to change the name of this building because this former governor was a segregationist, And then you have Thurman Hall in Columbia at USC, which was named after Strom Thurmond, an avid segregationist, even though he did have a biracial daughter. But it's just like, if you want to change the history of this country, if you want to extract slavery from the roots of this country, we're going to have to change the flag. We're going to have to change the national anthem. We're going to have to change everything. It's just a part of our past. And if this wasn't a multicultural society, we wouldn't even have to be having this conversation. So I find it very unfortunate, and I think our children are going to have to deal with it. We're dealing with it now, but can you imagine what it's going to be like in 50 years if trajectories stay the same?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, the other thing we'll have to change is the Constitution, because, and this is where I actually agree for liberals for the wrong reasons. I do agree with liberals that our Constitution is inherently racist, because ultimately the Constitution was not written for these other people.
Right.
It was literally written for white men of good character, or white people of good character.
Right.
And so when you have people who come from a different culture, a different background, a different heritage, that don't have the same laws, whether they be tribal or, or cultural laws. Mm-hmm. It's, like I said, the Constitution is based off of Saxon law, from way back in the day.
Yeah.
Well, so how a Constitution works, and it worked the same for any other country or nation going back in time, including Greece, which is that the laws actually frame the Constitution. And so the initial laws, whether they be immigration laws or what have you, were the ones that framed the Constitution. As they were stripped away, parts of the Constitution came to be able to be reinterpreted. And so everybody wants to point to the areas in the Constitution like, all men were created equal. But that's actually not what that even means, because what it's doing is it's referencing the line that comes after, which is essentially pointing to the sovereign, the sovereign king of England at the time and saying, look, guy, like, we're all the same. We're all are God's children. We're all, we all can die from poison or, hungry, thirst, whatever. But, so it's this idea that it's essentially framing something which comes later.
Right.
But anyway, so I definitely agree with you on that, it's, you're going to have to get literally strip the foundation of the U.S. just to create this multicultural zone.
Right.
And that's why they're tearing down the statues of General Lee.
Yep.
That's why they're tearing down the statues of Lincoln. I mean, they're going to have to go back and start tearing down the freaking statues of George Washington, and they'll probably even get some of their black founders too, because they were inherently racist as well.
Well, that's, when Donald Trump said, he was referring to the monuments, and he said, what's going to be next? George Washington. The media made a mockery of him. And not 24 hours later, a black pastor in Baltimore called for a park that's named after George Washington to be changed. Because our country is inherently racist because it was built for Europeans. And that's what I try to tell people. It's like the liberals not only think that the Constitution was written for non-white people in this country, they think that it also applies to anyone outside of this country. It's like, we have to let these people in. It's what our Constitution is about. It's what our founding was about. Well, no, our founders wrote the Constitution and created our society for European people. And the Constitution was written for white men in good faith. And I think there was an idea about, only white homeowners or something to that extent when we got into the modern era. But it's just, sometimes when I decided to start doing this back in January, it was kind of it ignited because of my daughter being born. And I was sitting in the hospital. I've always been infatuated with politics and engaged in it from junior high school. But I never had any desire to do this. But I was sitting in the hospital the day after Trump's inauguration, and we were about 8 hours away from having my first child. And I just, that night I began to think about 50 years down the road, 100 years down the road, when before then I might only think about 5 or 10 years thinking about my personal life. But at that point I was thinking about my child and grandchildren. And it's like, if I have a voice and I have a passion for this, then I need to do something about it. And I think, as we get on into the next week and the 5th and 6th week, I think you and I will probably dig a little bit deeper into identitarianism and the alt-right. But I think this is a really good episode to kind of brisk across the issues. Before we close it out, I think we're in the last 20 minutes. I do want to talk about some prepping stuff. I know you're kind of, I'm sure you're very into it. I've grown up around guns all my life. My dad and grandfather were my NRA members and my freedom and constitutional patriots and stuff, and which is a really good way to be brought up. It gives me that, that aspect in life. But I didn't really understand prepping until I met my wife, and it's a funny story. My wife's mother is a prepper. The reason for that is because my wife's dad died her senior year in high school, and so her mom felt like, she kind of had to step up, and they get off into some of the Alex Jones stuff, some of the things that I don't really get into, but there, I live about 80 to 100 yards off of the main road and it's still a rural road. And we live, on a big area of land. But do you think, and I know we could probably, talk about this issue or that issue, but if something ever collapsed, just say our economy collapsed, if we're in a bubble right now and all of a sudden we go into a financial crisis or the grid goes down or something like that, don't you think the way our society is now, our greatest enemy would be our neighbors? Do you think eventually that would be an issue once food becomes scarce? Or do you think we live in a tight enough community where we would not have to worry about that?
Well, I mean, I'll tell you like this, okay? During Fran, when all the power was out and whatnot, and, I was raised on a farm,
Mm-hmm.
and our neighbors, as soon as the power went out and everything started to thaw, we just started pulling out steaks from the fridge, from the ice box, and we started pulling the hamburger out and everything. We started grilling stuff. We called our neighbors over, and we just enjoyed it since we didn't have the electricity for like 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
So ultimately, I think it can happen several different ways. One is it'll either be like a slow decline, because the biggest thing that's going to hurt people is they're used to going places unhindered.
Right.
And so if the gas runs out and people have to start walking places, the first thing I think is going to happen is bicycles are going to start getting stolen like crazy, because people are going to want to go from point A to point B.
Right.
But ultimately, it's this idea that, that's going to be a major freak out. And then people are just going to have to chill, because, the world's going to go on, but you have to prepare for like it's the end of the world, because ultimately, when that does happen, when the power goes out, when the gas run, when there's no more gas to be had, and there's nobody delivering to the store as far as goods for you to go buy, it's like it's too late to prep for that point. At that point, so it's this idea that you need to have some sort of like a storage room or something where you put canned food or whatever, and you have to use it. Like, this is something I get on with my wife, is we can't just put something on the shelf and then leave it.
Right.
We have to use it, or else it's going to go bad, and then that's a waste of money.
Right.
So, it's just, it's this thing where you kind of do what, our grandparents used to do, where you go and, you put stuff back, and it just becomes a part of your life to put food back for the winter or for times of need. And so I would recommend, for people who either are starting prepping or they've been prepping for a while and they've been focusing on getting their guns, and they got their AR-15 and 1,000 rounds of ammo, or, whatever it may be, their body armor.
Yeah.
It's time to get back to basics. 'Cause I've been doing this, since I got out of the Army. It's like, I've been doing this for a little while, and I got all that shit. I got the AR-15, I've got the body armor, all that stuff, and then I started looking at it, all the basic stuff I totally neglected. I became this, this high-speed Death Ranger, and it's like you have to take a step back and say, okay, if you can do all this stuff, but if you don't have any food to feed yourself, then you're kind of screwed. Everyone says, "Oh, well, I've got all this ammo, I can just go hunt a deer." Well, the issue is with that, it depends on where you're at, I guess. But where we're at, if you pull the trigger and kill something in the woods, within just a matter of minutes, you'll have coyotes running all over the area, because they've learned that when they hear a gunshot, that means there's something dead.
Right.
And so then they go there and they'll try and find the scent of whatever it is and find it. And if it's just you with a gun in the woods that you're trying to pull a dead deer along, it's going to be kind of hard for you to fend off a pack of coyotes or whatever. But I've definitely had that happen with coyotes running up on me. It was kind of freaky.
Yeah, we have a terrible coyote problem. I'm on Riverland, and so we have about a mile from my home, through our property, we can access pretty large river that runs through this area. And we can sit out on our patio at night, and just hundreds and hundreds of them. I haven't had a situation where I've shot a deer, and them be there right then. And I've shot a few this year already, but I don't know. It's just, and when I was going back about the neighbor, I don't literally mean your neighbor. I just, when Hurricane Matthew hit 2 years ago, people just acted crazy. I mean, they acted crazy before and during and after. And it's like, is getting 6 loaves of bread and, 6 gallons of milk, is that going to save you? Is it worth getting in a wreck or fighting with your local citizens over? It's just crazy. It's like, you seem like a really calm, laid back person, and I am too in a certain way. But people, and I would say normies, they just act crazy, man, when something like this happens.
I mean, I definitely agree, especially in like cities where you have large populations, all kind of thrown in together. I mean,
yeah.
I mean, people who would be in the city would be at a major disadvantage, mainly because they're atomized, and unless they've actually got a community already squared away, then they're going to be kind of up a creek without a paddle kind of thing. So I mean, with people in the city, I mean, definitely food would be a big thing, but also the idea of like self-protection. And
right,
as we go through these series, these different episodes, we'll cover different guns that are better for self-defense and whatnot.
Yeah.
But I mean, the other thing that people also neglect is like medical supplies, food and medical supplies. People just, they go straight for the guns and the ammo, which are cool. You can see the YouTube videos where guys look, really high speed out on the range, but it's ultimately, that's only part of it. I mean, even in combat in the military, most of your time is, on your ass. You're just not doing anything. You're just sitting around waiting for shit to happen.
Right.
And it would probably be similar in this kind of a situation. Most of the time would be nothing happening, and you would just be prepping or getting stuff squared away, and you would just have to be prepared for when or if the people down the street decided to come and pick you as a target to see what you had.
Right.
And ultimately, I mean, it gets back to like, you get back to the days of like the Vikings. They believed that if you couldn't defend what you owned, then you didn't deserve it.
Right.
And so that's why they would challenge people to a battle, and then whoever won the battle got to keep the stuff.
Yeah.
But sadly, they're not going to challenge you to a duel or anything like that. They're just going to like, you'll know when they've got a rifle in your face.
Yeah. 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 I have, several ARs, and a couple of years back, there was a guy that had a 300 Blackout for sale, and I looked into that, and I think at that time I was in this kind of phase wanting to have really cool gear and not really thinking about like prices of ammunition and stuff. And the 300 Win Mags was, the ammunition was a lot higher than 5.56, and I never bought the gun. But I think, the AR-15, I think I've always heard it, American's rifle. I think the AR-15 is a really good gun. People are kind of going, like they're in a craze about it now. Whereas, 10 or 15 years ago, they weren't really that big. I mean, my dad, never really got into the tactical weapons or anything. We were always 30-06s or 270s or whatever for hunting purposes. But I don't think it can hurt to have guns and ammunition. I mean, I think anybody who has any sense should have them. But at the same time, I really like what you say about, really thinking about the basics. I mean, just the fact of having food and some sort of backup plan. If law enforcement is involved, or there's been, what's it called, where the president would declare martial law.
Martial law.
Yeah, I mean, if we have something like that, you know, it's like, to me, getting in an area where you can camp out and be away from people and just stay hidden. To me, that would be more essential than running into town, guns blazing, or something. You know, a scenario like that. But yeah, I think you'll bring. I think you'll bring another perspective to the table. You know, with your military background, I'm very excited about it. You know, because I have some people that listen in that are, you know, they're from these rural areas, and they're you know, they think along the same lines as you and I do. But we'll go ahead, and we're just over an hour, which I think is pretty good for the first episode. So for anybody listening in, don't forget to follow, and on this next one, actually, I will, if Jake, if you want me to, I will post all of your or your Twitter URL or whatever in the description. But for anyone listening in, don't forget to follow me on Twitter at realjohn_Wesley, also medium.com, where I publish all of my political articles. That's also medium.com/realjohn_Wesley. And anyway, thank you guys, and remember, the rebellion starts here.